When my husband and I returned from vacation, we found that the locks on our house were changed. My son came out on the porch and said, "Surprise! I transferred your house into my name. Now it's mine." But I opened my bag and showed him. Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Marjorie Ellen Calloway, and I spent 31 years in that house on Birchwood Lane. 31 years of Sunday dinners, of painting the porch railing every spring, of knowing exactly which floorboard creaked near the kitchen door and exactly how many seconds the downstairs shower took to run warm. That house was not just a property. It was the place where my late husband Harold held my hand through 2 miscarriages before Kevin was finally born healthy. It was where I planted the oak sapling that now shades the entire front yard. It was mine, paid off fully in 2009, the month before Harold passed. After Harold died, I kept going. That is what women of my generation do. I kept the garden, kept the book club on Thursdays, kept the friendship with my neighbor Ruth, who had lived next door since 1987. Kevin came by on holidays. He called on birthdays. I told myself that was normal. Grown children have their own lives. His wife Tiffany was polite in the way that people are polite when they are waiting for you to become useful or to disappear. I noticed it, but I filed it away, the way you file away a sound in the night that you decide must have been the wind. The first real signal came about 8 months before everything fell apart. Kevin called me, not on a Sunday, which was unusual, and asked very casually whether I had ever considered simplifying my estate planning. I told him I had a will. He said a will could take time to process through probate. He used the word probate carefully, like he'd rehearsed it. He suggested I speak to a lawyer he knew, a man named Dennis Farrell, who could help me set things up more efficiently. I said I'd think about it. I didn't call Dennis Farrell. Then in March, Kevin asked if he could borrow some documents, the deed, some old insurance paperwork, just to organize copies for his files. I said yes. I even handed him a folder. I want you to understand how natural he made it seem. He was my son. I had nursed him through chickenpox and a broken arm and a very bad junior year of high school. I handed him the folder without blinking. Looking back, I can see exactly when the pieces were being moved on the board. But when you love someone, you don't watch for chess moves. You watch for smiles. My husband and I keep saying that from habit. Harold had been gone 6 years, but I still traveled with his memory like luggage. Had been planning a trip to Portugal and Spain for over a year. I had a friend from my college years, Patricia, who had retired to Lisbon, and she had been asking me to visit for ages. When Ruth from next door offered to watch the house and water my plants, it felt like everything was falling into place. Kevin called the night before I left. He said, "Have a great trip, Mom. Don't worry about anything here." He sounded warm. He sounded like my son. 3 weeks later, my taxi pulled up to Birchwood Lane, and I noticed, before I even paid the driver, that the front door had a new handle, brushed nickel instead of the old brass. A small thing, but it caught my eye the way wrong things catch your eye when some part of your brain has already registered the danger. I walked up the porch steps with my rolling suitcase behind me, and I put my key in the lock. The key did not turn. I tried again. I stood there on my own porch in the September afternoon light, and my key did not turn in the lock of my own front door. Then the door opened from the inside. Kevin stood there, and behind him, I could see Tiffany in my kitchen, moving around like she already knew where everything was kept. Kevin looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Something between triumph and embarrassment, the look of a man who has done a thing and is not entirely sure he can sustain the nerve to see it through. "Surprise," he said. "Mom, we need to talk. I've had the house transferred into my name. It made sense, estate-wise. You'll see, it protects everyone. You can still live here, of course. We'll work out the details." He said it like he was doing me a favor. He stood in my doorway, the doorway I had walked through 10,000 times, and he smiled at me like he expected gratitude. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I reached down and opened my handbag. What was in my handbag at that moment was, frankly, nothing dramatic. My passport, my travel wallet, a paperback I had not finished on the plane, a receipt from a cafe in Lisbon where Patricia and I had split a bottle of wine and laughed until we cried. I reached in and I took out my phone, and I looked at Kevin with an expression I hoped was calmer than I felt, and I said, "I need to make a call. Give me a few minutes." He blinked. He had expected tears, I think, or arguments, or confusion. He had not expected calm. "Mom?" "A few minutes, Kevin." I walked back down the porch steps and stood in my driveway, and I called Ruth. She answered on the second ring. "Marjorie, are you back?" "How was—" "Ruth," I said, "I need you to come outside." She came out in her garden clogs and took one look at my face and said nothing foolish. She just took my arm and walked me to her kitchen and put the kettle on. That is the thing about a friendship of 35 years. No explanation required. Sitting at Ruth's table, drinking tea I could barely taste, I allowed myself to feel, for exactly 10 minutes, the full weight of what had happened. I want to be honest with you. It was crushing. Not just the betrayal of the act itself, though that was enormous, but the specific cruelty of its timing. Harold's house. The house I had kept alone for 6 years. The house that was the last physical evidence of our life together. My son had taken it while I was on an airplane somewhere over the Atlantic, and he had stood in the doorway and called it a surprise. I cried in Ruth's kitchen. I want you to know that, because what happened afterward was not the story of a woman who was never afraid. It was the story of a woman who was terrified and decided to move anyway. After 10 minutes, I stopped crying, and I asked Ruth if I could use her computer. The first thing I did was search the county property records online. It took me about 4 minutes to find it. There it was, 14 Birchwood Lane. Owner of record, updated 6 weeks ago. Kevin Harold Calloway. 6 weeks ago. While I was still home, still sleeping in my own bed, still watering my own garden. He had started this before I even left for Portugal. That landed differently than anything else. He hadn't acted in a moment of desperation or opportunity. He had planned it. I sat back in Ruth's chair, and I thought about Dennis Farrell, the lawyer Kevin had recommended 8 months ago. I thought about the folder of documents I had handed Kevin in March, and I thought about a conversation Harold and I had had years ago with our estate attorney, a woman named Carol Nguyen, who had done our wills and who had, at that time, explained to me very carefully the difference between a notarized transfer of deed and a forged one, and what each required. I hadn't fully understood it then. I understood it now. I had one significant advantage that Kevin did not know about. When he'd asked for the deed in March, I had handed him the folder, but the week before, entirely by chance, because I was reorganizing my filing cabinet, I had made a full set of photocopies of every document in that folder, including the deed, and I had brought those copies to my own attorney, a man named Gerald Pace, simply to have them reviewed in connection with updating my will. Gerald still had those copies on file. More importantly, Gerald knew what the original deed looked like, and he would know immediately whether any transfer had been executed with my genuine consent. I called Gerald's office from Ruth's kitchen. It was late afternoon. I got his voicemail. I left a message that was deliberately brief. "Gerald, this is Marjorie Calloway. I believe there may have been a fraudulent transfer of my property at Birchwood Lane. Please call me on my cell as soon as possible. This is urgent." Then I sat for a moment and I thought, what does Kevin think I will do? He thinks I will cry. He thinks I will argue and then accept. He has watched me be a widow for 6 years, and he has mistaken grief for weakness. And that is the most significant miscalculation he has ever made in his life. My first plan was simple. I would not confront Kevin again until I had spoken to Gerald. I would not show my hand. I would not let Kevin know that I was moving. I would stay at Ruth's, telling him I needed a few days to process things emotionally. Which was believable, which was even partly true. And in that time, I would understand exactly what he had done and exactly what it would take to undo it. I texted Kevin that evening. I need a few days. I'm staying with Ruth. I'll be in touch. He replied within 2 minutes. Of course, Mom. Take all the time you need. We can talk when you're ready. This is going to be good for all of us. I read that message twice. Good for all of us. I set down the phone and looked at Ruth across her kitchen table. He thinks he's already won, I said. Ruth wrapped both her hands around her mug. Then let him think it a little longer. Gerald Pace called me back at 8:15 the following morning. While I was sitting in Ruth's guest room with a cup of coffee I had made quietly so as not to wake her. He had heard my voicemail the previous evening, but had waited until a reasonable hour. That was Gerald. Methodical, unhurried. The kind of attorney who never moved faster than the situation required and never slower. I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, which I appreciated. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, Marjorie, I want you to come into the office today. Bring your passport, your phone, anything that documents when you were out of the country, and don't go back to the house yet. I was in his office on Clement Street by 10 o'clock. Gerald had already pulled up the county recorder's online database on his screen when I arrived, and he turned the monitor toward me so I could see what he'd found. The deed transfer had been recorded 43 days ago. It listed my name as grantor, meaning I had supposedly signed the house over willingly. Gerald pointed to the notary stamp. Do you recognize that notary? He asked. I leaned forward. The name on the stamp was Dennis Farrell. I looked at Gerald. That's the lawyer Kevin tried to refer me to 8 months ago. Gerald nodded slowly. Yes, I was afraid of something like that. He paused. Marjorie, I need to be direct with you. If someone signed your name on that deed, or if you signed something and were told it was a different document, that is deed fraud. It is a felony in this state. This is not a family dispute. This is a crime. He said it plainly, and I was grateful for that. There is a particular mercy in plainness. He pulled out the copies I had left with him in the spring, the originals I had given him for the will review. We compared the signatures. Mine on the old documents and mine on the new deed. Even I could see the difference. The letters were close, but the pressure, the angle of the lowercase l in Callaway, it was slightly wrong. Not dramatically wrong, carefully wrong in the way that someone practices. Can you prove this in court? I asked. A forensic document examiner can, Gerald said. And we have something else in our favor. You were out of the country when this was filed. Your passport stamps will show you were in Lisbon. An international travel record creates what's called an alibi of presence. It makes it essentially impossible to argue you were in this county signing documents. For the first time since I had stood on my porch with a key that didn't fit, I felt something shift inside my chest. Not relief. It was too early for relief. Something more like ground beneath my feet. Gerald filed an emergency title dispute that afternoon with the county recorder's office, which placed a legal cloud on the property, meaning Kevin could not sell it, refinance it, or take any further action with the title until the dispute was resolved. It did not give me back the house yet, but it stopped the bleeding. What I did not know, until Ruth told me that evening, was that Kevin had already driven slowly past her house twice that afternoon. Ruth had seen him from her front window, his gray SUV rolling past, slowing, not stopping. He was checking on me. He was watching. I thought about what that meant. He didn't know what I was doing, but he sensed movement. He had expected me to be crying in Ruth's guest room, and something, some instinct, was telling him I wasn't just crying. Tiffany called my cell at 6 that evening. She was warm, almost theatrical in her warmth. She called me Mom. She had not called me that in 2 years. "We've been worried about you," she said. "Kevin feels terrible that this was such a shock. We should have handled the conversation differently. We'd love for you to come over for dinner. To your house, I mean, and just talk through everything." Your house, I mean. A small slip, or perhaps deliberate. A reminder of who held the keys. "Thank you, Tiffany," I said. "I'm not ready for that yet. I'm still processing." "Of course," she said, in the tone of someone who is beginning to be impatient. "Just don't wait too long. We want this to be a positive thing for the whole family." After I hung up, I wrote down the exact words she had used. Not because I thought the phone call was evidence of anything, it wasn't, but because I had begun to understand that in a situation like this, everything needed to be recorded. Every conversation, every visit, every text. I had crossed a line that afternoon in Gerald's office that I could not uncross. Kevin and Tiffany had committed a crime, and I was going to prove it. There was no version of this that ended with forgiveness and Sunday dinners. I understood that now, and I accepted it. Which was perhaps the hardest single moment in this entire story. The grief of it was real, but so was my resolve. The next morning, I asked Ruth to drive me to the county assessor's office in person because some things are better done face to face. I brought my passport, my travel itinerary, the printout of the recorded deed that Gerald had prepared, and a letter from Gerald on his firm's letterhead formally notifying the county of the disputed transfer. The clerk, a young woman with reading glasses on a chain, looked at my documents and then looked at me over the top of her glasses, and something in her expression changed. "Ma'am," she said more quietly, "did someone forge your signature on this deed?" "That's what we believe," I said. She took an extra copy of everything I had brought, stamped my set as received, and gave me a case number. She also gave me, unprompted, a card for the County District Attorney's Consumer Fraud Division. "You might want to call them," she said, sliding it across the counter, "just in case." That afternoon, Gerald submitted a formal complaint to the State Bar Association regarding Dennis Farrell, the notary attorney, whose stamp appeared on the fraudulent document. This was a separate track from the title dispute. Slower, but significant. A notary who stamps a fraudulent document is in serious professional and legal jeopardy. Dennis Farrell was, Gerald had learned through a quick check of public records, not Kevin's casual acquaintance. He was Tiffany's second cousin. That detail crystallized something for me. This had not been Kevin acting alone out of some impulsive desperation. Tiffany had brought the instrument. Tiffany had arranged the mechanism. Kevin had walked up to my door and delivered the speech, but Tiffany had engineered the architecture. I was back at Ruth's that evening when Kevin called. Not a text this time. A call, which told me something. He was no longer comfortable with the distance that text messages create. "I heard you went to the county offices today," he said. I kept my voice even. "Where did you hear that? It doesn't matter." A pause. "Mom, I need you to understand something. What I did was legal. I had every right to protect family assets. If you keep pushing this, you're going to create a legal situation that hurts everyone, including you. It's going to cost money. It's going to take time. It's going to become a public record. Is that really what you want?" He was trying to present it as a warning delivered in my interest, but what I heard underneath it was the first tremor of fear. "I appreciate your concern," I said. "I'll be in touch." He didn't like that. "Mom, good night, Kevin." 3 days later, Kevin and Tiffany showed up at Ruth's front door. I was in the kitchen. Ruth answered, and I heard Tiffany's voice before I heard Kevin's. High, controlled, with that particular quality of someone performing patience. Ruth, to her eternal credit, did not let them in. She stood in the doorway and said, "Marjorie isn't available right now. Kevin said he just needed 5 minutes." Tiffany said they had brought food. She used the word reconciliation, which was, I thought, a very particular choice. Ruth said she would pass along the message. But they didn't leave. They stood on Ruth's porch for nearly 10 minutes, and through the kitchen window, I watched Kevin pace twice the length of the porch. Then Tiffany said something to him I couldn't hear, and he stopped pacing and said, loudly enough that I could hear through the glass, "She has no idea what she's doing. Gerald Pace is a small-time attorney, and this is going to go nowhere." Ruth closed the door. She came into the kitchen and sat across from me. "He's scared," she said. "I know," I said. "Scared people are dangerous." The following day, Gerald called with an update. The title cloud was holding. The county had flagged the transaction for investigation, and Gerald had reached out, quietly, to a forensic document examiner, a retired FBI specialist named Margaret Okonkwo, who had agreed to review the signature comparison. Her preliminary opinion, based on the copies. The signature on the deed was not mine. That was not a legal finding yet. But it was, as Gerald put it, significant momentum. After I hung up, I sat for a long time in Ruth's guest room, looking out at the backyard where her bird feeder needed refilling, and I let myself feel, briefly, the exhaustion. Not defeat. I was nowhere near defeat. But the particular tiredness of sustained alertness, of watching every word and every door and every car that slows in front of a friend's house. I gave myself the weekend. I called Patricia in Lisbon and told her, briefly, without drama, what had happened. She listened and then said, "Marjorie, you are the most competent person I have ever known. Handle your business and then come visit again next spring." It made me laugh, which was what I needed. I slept. I read the rest of my paperback. I let Ruth feed me her excellent chicken soup. On Monday morning, I got up, made my bed, and went back to work. Monday arrived with cool fog and the smell of Ruth's coffee, and I moved through the morning with the particular clarity that rest gives you when you have allowed yourself to actually rest. I returned calls to Gerald. I wrote a precise, factual account of every event since my return. Dates, times, exact words. Because Gerald had asked me to, and also because the act of writing it helped me see the shape of things more clearly. It is harder to panic about a situation you have documented. Kevin sent me a text at 11 that morning. It was careful and polished in a way that suggested Tiffany had edited it. "Mom, we've been thinking, and we want to do right by you. We'd like to set up a monthly payment, your choice of amount, so you have financial security and peace of mind, and you can continue living in the house for as long as you want. We love you and just want this resolved." I read it twice, and I will be honest with you. For a brief moment, something in me wanted to be tired enough to accept it. Not because I believed them, but because resolution, even a false one, promises an end to vigilance, and vigilance is exhausting. But I thought about what that offer actually was. It was Kevin proposing to pay me a stipend to live in my own house, which he had stolen. It was Tiffany offering me the comfort of a situation they had engineered. It was, in short, a cage decorated with a monthly deposit. I replied, "Thank you for reaching out. I am working with my attorney and cannot discuss terms outside that process." Gerald had advised this exact language. It was factual, it was lawful, and it communicated without saying so that I was no longer operating alone. There was no reply for 2 hours. Then, "We didn't know you'd gotten an attorney involved. We just wanted to keep this in the family." I forwarded that text to Gerald. What happened next surprised me, and I think it is important to tell you about it because it was the part of this experience that I did not expect, and it turned out to matter enormously. Ruth had, without telling me, mentioned what was happening to 2 other women in our Thursday book club, Joan, a retired school teacher, and Beverly, who had worked in the county clerk's office for 22 years before retiring. She had not gossiped. She had been worried about me and had reached out to people she trusted. Beverly called me that Monday afternoon. She had, she said, seen situations like mine before. Not often, but before. She knew the specific language of how county records offices handled fraud investigations. She knew the names of 2 people in the district attorney's office who took property crimes against elderly residents seriously. She offered to make introductions on my behalf. I sat in Ruth's armchair and listened to Beverly speak with the calm efficiency of someone who knows exactly which doors to knock on and in what order. And I felt something I had not felt since I had stood on my porch with a key that wouldn't turn. I felt that I was not alone. Joan came by that evening with a casserole and a copy of a newspaper article about a similar case in a neighboring county. A grown child who had used a questionable power of attorney to transfer a parent's property. That case had been reversed in court. The child had been charged. Joan had underlined the relevant paragraphs in pencil with the same quiet intention with which she had, no doubt, annotated books for 40 years of teaching. "I looked it up because I wanted you to see it was possible," she said, "not to upset you. That is community. That is what it looks like when it functions correctly." With Beverly's introductions, Gerald was able to get a meeting with an assistant district attorney named Rashida Coleman within the week. He briefed me afterward. Coleman had reviewed Gerald's preliminary findings and confirmed that the evidence, if it held, was consistent with deed fraud under state law. She was not making promises. She never would at that stage. But she had opened a file. Meanwhile, Kevin and Tiffany had gone quiet. No calls, no texts, no slow drives past Ruth's house. This silence felt deliberate, strategic, the quiet of people who are recalculating. I was not fooled by it. I had grown up in a house with a father who went quiet before he dug in, and I recognized the pattern. They were not retreating. They were watching to see what I would do next, waiting for a moment of uncertainty they could enter. I gave them nothing to enter. I kept my phone conversations short and documented. I continued staying with Ruth. I did not drive past my own house, though I wanted to. Not out of sentimentality, but because I wanted to see the oak tree, Harold's oak tree, and know it was still there. But I did not go. There was a time for that, and it was not yet. They came on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after the text exchange, and this time they did not come to Ruth's door. They came to Gerald's office. I was not there when they arrived. I was at the county recorder's office with Beverly, who was helping me navigate a supplemental records request. But Gerald's assistant called me and told me Kevin and Tiffany were in the waiting room without an appointment, asking to speak with Gerald. Gerald had his assistant inform them that he could not discuss an active legal matter with opposing parties without their counsel present, and that they were welcome to have their attorney contact his office. Tiffany had apparently replied that they didn't have an attorney, that this was a family matter, and that surely Gerald could just let them explain. Gerald did not let them explain. They waited 20 minutes and left. That evening, Kevin called me. I answered, because by then I had established a clear record of all our communications, and I wanted this one documented too. "Mom, I want to come see you." His voice was different from the last time. Softer, with something underneath it that I recognized, because I had heard it when he was a boy who had done something wrong and was hoping charm could repair it. Not at Ruth's. Somewhere neutral. Coffee, just the 2 of us. No Tiffany. No Tiffany was, I realized, intended to be a concession, a sign of good faith. I thought for a moment. Gerald had advised me not to meet with Kevin without counsel. But Gerald had also said that any communication Kevin initiated was useful, as long as I controlled the setting and kept records. A public coffee shop, with my phone recording, seemed manageable. We met Saturday morning at a cafe on Morrison Street that neither of us had particular associations with, neutral ground, as he'd said, in a room full of people ordering lattes and working on laptops. Kevin arrived looking tired. That surprised me. I had been sleeping better than I had in weeks. He, apparently, had not. He started carefully. He said he loved me. He said he had made a mistake in the way he had handled things. He said he was sorry for the shock of the homecoming. Then he moved, almost without transition, into what I recognized as the real agenda. "You have to understand that Tiffany and I are in a difficult position financially," he said. "The house. We used the value of the house to secure some financing. There are people involved now who aren't us. If this title dispute goes forward, it's not just Kevin and Tiffany who get hurt. There are financial institutions. There are obligations." I looked at him steadily. "You used my house as collateral?" He had the grace to look uncomfortable. "We needed capital. It was supposed to be a bridge solution. We were going to sort it out before you even—" "Before I knew," I said. He stopped. "Mom, if you push this, it doesn't just affect us. It affects you, your credit, your name. You'll be entangled in this for years. Gerald Pace is not equipped to fight what's coming. I'm trying to protect you." There it was, the threat dressed as protection, the cage presented as shelter. I thought, sitting in that cafe, about what it must have cost him to come here. Not emotionally, but strategically. He would not have come unless he was genuinely worried. The title cloud was working. The DA's office had opened a file. Something had moved enough that Kevin felt he needed to apply pressure in person. I looked at my son across the table. This man I had raised, this man for whom I had once sat in a hospital waiting room for 11 hours. And I felt grief. And I felt fury. And underneath both of those, I felt something very cold and very clear. "Kevin," I said, "I'm going to suggest that you hire an attorney, a real one, not Dennis Farrell." His face changed. The softness left it like water draining from a bowl. "You don't know what you're doing," he said. Not angry yet. Something more controlled than anger, something I found more alarming. "Tiffany and I have resources you don't know about, and we have time." "So do I said. I left the cafe first. I walked to my car, sat inside with the doors locked, and let my hands shake for exactly 3 minutes. Because he had frightened me. I want to be honest about that. He had frightened me. Not with any specific threat, but with the look on his face when the charm dropped. The look of someone who has been exposed and is deciding what to do about it. But here is what I understood. Driving back to Ruth's house. The fear was real, and the fear was useful. A woman who feels no fear is a woman who is underestimating the danger. I was not underestimating it. I was counting it accurately, and I was choosing to move forward anyway. I called Gerald from the car and told him about the financing. He was silent for a moment, and then he said very quietly, "He used the house as collateral." That's what he told me. "Marjorie," Gerald said, "that changes things considerably. We need to talk to Rashida Coleman again, today." Gerald had the meeting with Rashida Coleman arranged by Monday morning, and this time I was in the room. Coleman's office was on the 4th floor of the county courthouse. A room that smelled of paper and effort, with case files stacked in precise columns along one wall. She was younger than I had expected, maybe 40, with the particular alertness of someone who does not waste attention on things that don't matter and misses nothing that does. Gerald had prepared a complete dossier. I watched Coleman read through it. The original deed copies Gerald had on file, the new fraudulent transfer, the signature comparison from Margaret Okonkwo, my passport stamps, the documented timeline, the records of Kevin's calls and texts, and now, the most recent and most significant addition, Gerald's research into the loan Kevin had mentioned at the cafe. That research had taken Gerald's paralegal less than 48 hours. Kevin and Tiffany had taken out a home equity loan against my house, a property that, at the time, had been fraudulently transferred into Kevin's name, for $230,000. The lender was a private financial firm, not a bank, which explained why the underwriting had not flagged the ownership irregularity. The loan had been issued 3 weeks after the deed transfer. Coleman read this and looked up at me. "Mrs. Calloway, I want to ask you something directly. Did you at any point give your son authorization to take out a loan against your property?" "No," I said, "I did not." "Were you aware of this loan in any form?" "No, I was in Portugal." She made a note. "This is no longer just deed fraud," she said. "Using fraudulently obtained property as collateral for a loan is bank fraud. Federal jurisdiction applies when a financial institution is involved in the deception, even a private one, if they operate across state lines." She paused. "I need to make some calls." What happened next took 3 weeks to arrange, but Gerald kept me informed at every step. Coleman coordinated with the DA's office and, because of the financial institution element, a federal financial crimes investigator became involved. Kevin and Tiffany were formally served with notice of the criminal investigation. Dennis Farrell, upon being contacted by the state bar and the DA simultaneously, retained his own attorney within 24 hours, which told everyone what they needed to know about what Dennis Farrell intended to do when things became difficult. He cooperated. Gerald called me on a Tuesday evening and said, "Dennis Farrell gave a full statement. He has confirmed that he was paid by Kevin to notarize a document with your signature, which had been forged. He has provided documentation of the payment and communications regarding the arrangement." I sat down slowly. "Kevin paid him?" "Yes." "And Tiffany arranged the connection?" "Farrell's statement includes email communications with Tiffany organizing the transaction." The confrontation happened on a Wednesday afternoon in a conference room at the county courthouse. I had not requested it. Coleman had arranged it as part of the investigation process, a formal recorded interview with Kevin and Tiffany, in which they were given the opportunity to provide their account. Gerald attended with me as a private witness to proceedings. I was not technically a party to the criminal interview. But Coleman had allowed me to be present because, as she said, the victim has a right to witness the process. Kevin and Tiffany arrived with an attorney they had evidently hired very recently, a man I didn't recognize who kept whispering to Kevin as Coleman laid out what the investigation had found. I sat across the table and I watched my son's face as the evidence was presented, piece by piece. He tried first to maintain that the transfer had been legitimate, that I had signed documents before the trip and had perhaps forgotten. His attorney whispered something, and Kevin stopped talking. Tiffany tried a different approach. She said the whole matter was a misunderstanding, that the family had simply been trying to plan ahead, that there was no intent to deceive. Coleman placed the emails between Tiffany and Dennis Farrell on the table. The emails discussing the fee for notarization and the need for the signature to look as close as possible. Tiffany looked at those emails for a long time. A very long time. Long enough that the silence in the room became its own kind of verdict. "Those could be misinterpreted," Kevin said finally. Coleman looked at him with the expression of someone who has heard this sentence many times and has long since stopped finding it interesting. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "the document examiner's finding is that the signature on the deed transfer is not your mother's. Your cousin by marriage has confirmed in a sworn statement that he was paid to notarize a document he knew to be fraudulent. You obtained a $230,000 loan against a property you did not legally own. How would you prefer those facts to be interpreted?" Kevin had no answer. He looked at Tiffany, and I watched him do it. That small, involuntary turn of the head toward the person he had done all of this with, looking for something she could not give him now. Tiffany was staring at the table. She did not look back. Their attorney put his hand on Kevin's arm. "Don't answer." What struck me in that moment was how small they had both become. Not physically, but in the way that people shrink when the version of themselves they have been performing collapses, and there is nothing underneath it substantial enough to stand on. Kevin had walked into that room as a man with a plan, with a story, with the practiced confidence of someone who had spent months believing he was smarter than everyone around him. Now he sat in a county courthouse chair and looked at the table and had nothing to say. I had spent 31 years in that house. I had raised this man in that house. And I understood, sitting in that room, that the greatest miscalculation he had ever made was not legal or financial. It was personal. He had looked at me, his mother, a widow, a woman in her late 60s who cried in her friend's kitchen, and he had seen someone who could be outmaneuvered. He had not seen someone who had buried a husband and kept a house and built a life with her own 2 hands and knew, at the cellular level, what was worth fighting for. I did not feel triumph in that moment. What I felt was something harder to name. A clarity that comes when a thing you were afraid to look at directly is finally just sitting in the light. I looked at Kevin once, directly, before I left the room. He looked away first. The legal process did not move the way drama does. It moved the way bureaucracy does, which is to say deliberately, with paperwork and waiting periods and precise procedural language. But it moved decisively, and it moved in one direction. Within 10 days of the recorded interview, Kevin's attorney contacted Gerald with an offer. Kevin would sign a quitclaim deed restoring full ownership of 14 Birchwood Lane to me, in exchange for me agreeing not to pursue additional civil litigation. Gerald brought me the offer. I looked at it for a moment, and then I asked Gerald what he thought my position was. "Excellent," he said. "Coleman's investigation is proceeding regardless of any civil agreement. You don't need to trade anything for the house. The title will be restored through the criminal restitution process." "Then no," I said. Gerald delivered that to Kevin's attorney, and I understand there was a long pause on the phone before the man said he would consult with his client. I imagine that pause contained a great deal of recalibration. Kevin and Tiffany were formally charged 8 weeks after the courthouse meeting. Kevin faced charges of deed fraud and conspiracy to commit fraud. Tiffany faced identical charges, plus an additional count related to her direct role in coordinating the forgery. Dennis Farrell, in exchange for his cooperation, was charged with a reduced single count of notarial misconduct, a charge that would nonetheless result in permanent revocation of his professional license and, under the terms of his plea, a substantial fine. The loan against my house, $230,000, was a more complicated thread. Because the lender, a private firm called Meridian Capital, had failed to conduct adequate title verification, they bore partial responsibility for the fraudulent transaction. Their attorneys and Gerald's spent 6 weeks negotiating the terms under which the loan would be voided, and Meridian would pursue Kevin directly for recovery of the funds. My property was released from that lien entirely. The debt became Kevin's problem, as it should always have been. The deed was formally restored to my name on a Tuesday morning in November. Gerald called me while I was at Ruth's kitchen table and said, "Marjorie, you are the legal and sole owner of 14 Birchwood Lane as of 9:47 this morning." I said thank you. Then I sat very quietly for a moment, holding the phone against my chest, not because I was composing myself, but because I needed to feel the weight of the sentence before I set it down. 9:47 on a Tuesday morning. That was when it became, again, irrevocably, mine. Ruth drove me to the house. I had not been there in nearly 3 months. It was November, so the garden was quiet, the roses cut back, the beds mulched for winter, because Ruth had arranged for a neighbor's son to tend it while I was away. The oak tree stood in the front yard where it had always stood, broad and unhurried, the way Harold had always been. I stopped on the sidewalk and looked at it for a moment before I went up the steps. The county had arranged for the locks to be changed, back, this time, with keys that were mine. I stood on the porch and I put my key in, and it turned cleanly the first try. Such a small thing. Such a completely unremarkable thing, a key turning in a lock. I had done it 10,000 times and never thought about it once. I thought about it now. I walked through the rooms slowly. Kevin and Tiffany had been living there for nearly 3 months, and the marks of their presence were everywhere. Furniture moved, a new rug in the living room that was not mine, different soap in the bathroom, a coffee maker on the counter that I didn't recognize. These things bothered me less than I expected. They were just objects. Objects can be moved. The house was still the house. The angle of afternoon light through the dining room window was exactly as I had always known it. The particular sound the furnace made when it kicked on in cold weather was the same. The garden outside the back door was patient and waiting and still mine. In the kitchen, the creak in the third drawer from the left was exactly where I had left it. I stood at the kitchen window and looked at the yard, and I thought about Harold. And I thought about 31 years. And I thought about the 9-year-old version of Kevin, who had once stood in this same yard trying to build a birdhouse with his father, and made a mess of it, and been proud of it anyway. I allowed myself to grieve that version of Kevin, briefly, because it deserved to be grieved. Then I put the kettle on. Kevin and Tiffany had been required, as a condition of the criminal proceedings, to vacate the property and account for any damage or items removed. Their attorney sent a list and a payment for assessed damages. I reviewed it, confirmed it was accurate, and signed the acknowledgement. That was the last direct correspondence I had with anyone representing Kevin. Kevin's plea agreement, finalized the following spring, included probation, mandatory community service, full restitution of my legal costs, and a criminal record that would follow him through every professional background check for the rest of his working life. Tiffany's agreement was nearly identical. Kevin lost his position at the finance firm when the conviction became public. These things always do become public, because they are public record, and because people talk. He had built a career in a field that considers fiduciary trust foundational. A fraud conviction is not a speed bump in that field. It is a wall. I did not feel vindicated. I felt that something had been corrected. There is a difference, and it matters. That first winter back in the house, I repainted the porch railing. Not because it needed it, Ruth's neighbor's son had done a fine job, but because I wanted to. I wanted the particular ritual of it. The smell of paint in cold air, the brush in my hand moving in long, steady strokes, the sense of returning a thing to its proper order. It took me an afternoon, and I was sore the next day, and I did not care at all. I also, in January, updated my will with Gerald and converted the deed into a living trust structured with multiple layers of verification. Any future transfer would require my in-person, notarized, witnessed consent, with a mandatory review period built in. Gerald had recommended this years ago. I simply had not gotten around to it. I got around to it now. Better late than right about Kevin, as Ruth said, and we both laughed. And it was the kind of laughter that is only possible on the other side of something hard. In February, I took a short class at the community center. Watercolor painting, which I had always been curious about and never tried. I was not talented. I did not need to be. I sat on Tuesday evenings at a long table with 7 other people ranging in age from 30 to 84, and I made imprecise paintings of flowers and landscapes, and I drank the bad coffee they provided, and I came home pleased. Is that not enough? It seemed like more than enough to me. Ruth and I had dinner together every Thursday. Joan and Beverly came regularly. The book club continued. We had been reading together long enough that we had a shorthand, a generosity of attention with each other that takes years to build and is, in my view, one of the most valuable things a person can accumulate. Beverly, who had been so practically useful during the worst of things, became a closer friend than she had been before. There is a particular bond that forms between people who have been useful to each other in a crisis, something more solid than ordinary affection. We went to a lecture series at the public library together in the spring, 4 Tuesday evenings on American landscape painting, and argued pleasantly about Winslow Homer afterward over dinner. It was very good. In the spring, I called Patricia in Lisbon and told her it was finally over. She said she had never doubted me for a single day. I cried a little, which she politely pretended not to notice, and then she told me about a small apartment near her building available for rent in August and asked whether I might want to come back. I said I would think about it. I thought about it for approximately 4 days, and then I booked the flights. I went in August. 3 weeks. Lisbon. A long weekend in the Algarve. A day trip to a small hilltop town whose name I cannot now spell, but whose bread I still think about. I swam in the Atlantic for the first time in years. I ate sardines on a terrace in the evening light with Patricia, who has aged the way that interesting people age, with more character and more humor, and not enough patience for pretense. We talked about Harold. We talked about her late husband, Ernesto. We talked about what it means to have a life that is genuinely yours, and whether that is something you choose or something you build or both. I came back to Birchwood Lane in September, walked through my front door, set down my bag, made tea, and stood in the kitchen, listening to the ordinary sounds of the place. The furnace, the refrigerator, the third drawer from the left if you pulled it wrong. This is mine, I thought. This was always mine. And that is settled now. What happened to Kevin and Tiffany in that same period is a matter of public record and straightforward consequence, and I will tell you plainly, because I think plainness is what they deserve. Kevin's conviction became known in his professional community within weeks of sentencing. These things move quickly, and the financial services world is smaller than it appears from the outside. He was dismissed from his firm. He applied elsewhere, I was told by mutual acquaintances who felt I had a right to know and were probably correct. He did not find comparable work. A fraud conviction in a field built on trust is not something that can be managed or reframed. It simply sits there in every background check, on every professional record, waiting to be found. The civil judgment Meridian Capital obtained against him for the $230,000 was documented in public court records as well. That kind of debt, at interest, does not shrink. Tiffany's professional life suffered comparably. She had worked in real estate, a field with its own licensing requirements and ethics standards, both of which her conviction implicated. Her license was reviewed and ultimately suspended, pending the outcome of a professional conduct proceeding. Whether she recovered it, I don't know. I did not look further than that. Dennis Farrell, whose cooperation had been so instrumental to the outcome, did not escape consequence simply because he had cooperated. His license was revoked permanently. He paid his fine. What he did afterward with a life stripped of its professional identity was not something I followed. I heard through those same mutual acquaintances the following year that Kevin and Tiffany had separated. I did not seek the details. I did not need them. A marriage constructed partly on shared criminal conspiracy and partly on the sustained belief that an elderly widow could be outmaneuvered indefinitely is not a marriage built on anything that holds. I was not surprised. I was not satisfied, exactly. I did not feel their unhappiness as a reward. I felt it as consequence, which is a different and more accurate thing. What I felt as reward was simpler and more durable. My own life returned to me whole. I planted bulbs that October, tulips and daffodils both, pushed into the cold front garden soil one by one in the late afternoon, while the light went amber and the oak tree threw its long shadow across the yard. Harold had liked daffodils. I had always planted them for him. I planted them again for both of us, and for myself, and for the simple, stubborn fact of continuity, that a thing buried in cold ground in autumn comes back in March without being asked, without needing to be convinced, because that is simply what it does. The daffodils came up in March, yellow and ordinary and entirely mine. I stood at the living room window and looked at them, and I thought, this is what staying looks like. Not the dramatic staying of a crisis, but the quiet staying of a morning in your own house, with your key on the hook by the door and your name on the deed, and nowhere in particular you have to be. That is enough. That is, in fact, everything. I have told you this story because I want you to understand something. Age does not make you a target unless you allow fear to make you passive. The moment I chose to act, not to fight, but simply to move, everything changed. If your name is on a document, protect it. Know your rights. Build relationships with people who will stand beside you. And if someone tries to take what is yours while calling it a favor, open your handbag and start documenting. What would you have done in my place? I'd love to know. Thank you for listening.